Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to paint a simple watercolor landscape. The reference image is a photo I took when I was on a short trip at Como Lake 2 years ago. I'm soaking the paper with a lot of clean water. For large washes I'm using this flat brush made by Tintoretto from Sintetico hair. I'll be using also Tintoretto number 6 synthetic brush, Vajo Kazan. It's a good brush that retains water. It is very thirsty when it is dried. And also for details I'll be using Winsor brush number 4. Also synthetic hairs. The paper I'm using today is made by SMLT Art. It's professional quality watercolor paper, 100% cotton, 300 GSM. The colors I'll be using are made by Maimeri blue. I'd like to use only 4 colors for today's painting: yellow ochre, burnt sienna, permanent red and blue cobalt. I squeezed them into my palette. My foldable palette is filled with colors, also made by Maimeri blue, and this is a very economical way to use watercolors, because a tube can last longer than pans of watercolor. After the paper soaked, I am starting to lay the sky with this cobalt blue. With a lot of water, I'm making a very light blue wash. Starting from the top of the paper, with a slight inclination, I'm starting to lay this flat wash of sky. In some parts I leave a few spots of white paper to make the clouds like this, because in this image there is also the reflection of the lake. I'll go down with this blue color, because the sky is reflected on the surface of water. To make a stronger statement of the sky, I'm adding a stronger wash of color to make like a vignette on the upper edge of the painting. The water spreads in an unpredictable way and make an organic shape of the sky. Adding more color on the upper part to create the illusion of wide space, because when you look at the sky right above our heads, it looks more colored and saturated, and if you look in the distance, the colors and the blue of the sky recedes at the horizon line. While the first wash dries a bit, I am preparing the next mixture of color. In the pool of cobalt blue, I am adding a bit of this red dip to make this gray bluish color for the distant hills and mountains that can be seen in this scenery. While the paper is still wet from the previous layer, we can try and put the next layer of distant mountains and to see what happens. In some parts the color might bleed and spread, but this is the beauty of watercolor. With fully loaded brush, we are going to lay down the distant mountains in the middle third of the paper. The brush should be loaded with color because you don't want that the color finishes until you end laying down this wash. So the color spreads in an unpredictable way, as it was expected. Here I would like to try to preserve some white of the paper because there is a tower in the distance, and this white is very effective in the distance. It can be seen contrasting with the dark of the mountains. While this wash is still wet, we can correct some mistakes, so-called mistakes. We can reveal back the white of the paper, just wiping off the excess of the color. For this technique you should wash your brush and dry off. You can add a few more white shapes for the distant houses that can be seen on the view. Later, after this wash dries, we'll apply wet on dry color to be more precise for the foreground of the landscape. For the next layer, the color mixture is a dull gray, made from the previous pool of color, adding yellow ochre, and we obtain this muddy green to make the distant hills. The paper dried, you can check this with the back of your hand. Let's dive in for the next layer. So with the same large brush, I'm representing the next range of hills or mountains. So this is a flat wash. This is a simplified approach of the landscape. You don't need to represent every detail at this stage. We might leave some negative shapes in the bottom part of the hill for the houses and the buildings in this city. Some towers, some rooftops, just like that, and continuing in this way to make more regular shapes in this bottom part, and in the upper part the trees can be represented in organic free form. On the right side of the landscape, the hills are darker because they are in the shade, so I added more cobalt blue to the mixture to make it darker, and continuing in the same way to represent this hill on the right side of the landscape. The water in the container is already muddy, so I'll change it with fresh, clean water. Switching to a smaller brush with a sharp point, I'll start adding the shapes of the houses and buildings. For the houses and buildings, I'll be using these warm colors: yellow ochre, red deep, and burnt sienna. I'll start with yellow ochre as a main color. Yellow ochre is widely used in landscapes, in urban sketching, in architectural drawings and paintings. This is more of mood painting, describing air, water, the atmosphere, so I'll not worry too much about architectural details. I'll represent the whole city part with houses and buildings in an abstract way, resembling houses. So I'll draw many rectangular, triangular shapes to fill in this area of city. Right now I'm not looking at the reference image. I'm painting from memory and imagination. Being such a complex scene, it doesn't need to be represented in every detail, just the resemblance of houses. So I'm adding here and there these shapes resembling houses, buildings. This is an old city with yellow houses, red roofs, with brick walls. So these earth tones are appropriate to depict such scenery. Not all surface needs to be covered in color. Some walls are white. You can add white for some reflections, some highlights. Now I'll switch to this burnt sienna. It's a reddish earth color. Add it to yellow ochre to make this orangey tone. Going on to adding more tone to the cityscape. The colors blend and bleed through each other, being still wet. The previous layer, triangular shapes, rooftops. This is just up to you how to fill this scenery. It's a free form, you don't need to bother too much about it. The colors blend beautifully and they harmonize. meaning that yellow ochre and burnt sienna are close to each other on the color wheel, so they don't clash, making a muddy color like would do red and green, or yellow and purple. Now adding pure burnt sienna to deepen some tones, to make more interesting. Actually, varying and making more diverse this scenery makes it more interesting. So adding here and there some shapes, some deeper color. Next mixture is a bit of blue cobalt mixed with burnt sienna to make a gray like this grayish color. With this grayish color I'll make the shadow part of the tower, and I'll leave the sunlit face of the tower without color. That is the light part of the building. This is the triangular part of the roof. Also I'll leave the sunlit without color. I'll add a few details to make this resemble the tower. Some windows here. With the same muddy violet gray, I'll add shadows to other buildings in the city. This shadow is appropriate for white buildings, because in the shadow the white is not pure white and has this cool color. So adding here and there, letting the color mix with the previous layers, and making it more interesting. This little town starts to get shape, adding depth, light and shadow. This is just a play of light and shadow. For some rooftops we can add this deep red, and to make the resemblance of rooftops. Now let's move to the reflection of the lake, to the surface of the lake. For this step I'll re-wet the surface of paper in some parts, mainly on the left part, and on the right I'll leave a bit of dry paper. For this step I'll mix cobalt blue with yellow ochre, and we have this green color. I'll add a bit of red to mute it. It's a bit green deep. I think I'll add a bit of burnt sienna and a bit more of cobalt blue to make this green, deep green color. The surface of paper being wet, I'll start adding the reflections on water, this green. The color spreads beautifully in different directions, making the illusion of reflected hills. So we let the color spread and bleed and make its job, just like this. Here with the tip of the brush we do these ripples of the water, making sure that we leave the reflections untouched to preserve the lighter color of the paper. Adding here more and deepening the shadow, making the ripples of the water with these horizontal strokes. With the same green mixture, I'll make some cypress trees that can be seen in the distance. This area that I visited more than 2.5 years ago has a lot of cypress trees, and they are seen from the distance. It's a beautiful landscape, inspiring to paint it. I painted it also on location. To make more diverse, I'll do some of this roundish. In this way also contrast can be made to the houses. Adding more cypress trees. They contrast with the horizontal laying of the houses. Here some other trees, just to suggest. Also between houses there can be some trees, some greenery. Just playing with the brush, with the tip of the brush, and making calligraphic marks here and there. This is a very relaxing activity. Once the surface of the water dried a bit, I'll add a bit more of ripples, even though they still bleed, to make the suggestion of water. Here, this part being a shadow, a deep shadow, I'll add more of this deep green. While the paper is still wet, with the completely dried brush, some reflections can be pulled out from the paper like this. Also in different waveform directions. And at the edges some color can be pulled in this part to suggest the ripples of the water. Now I'll be using the smallest brush, number 4, for adding some architectural details to the cityscape. For the darkest color I'll mix some cobalt blue and some deep red to make this deep color. For the final details, the consistency of watercolor is the consistency of melted butter. So I'll add details to the houses. Somewhere where the shadow can be casted under the rooftops, I'll add some windows. Doors, fences, some poles. Here you can draw as long as you want, but the danger of this part is that you might kill the painting if you overdo it, so be careful when to stop the painting. Some fences, poles. The details shouldn't be very defined, they only need to suggest that something happens there, just to complete the story of the painting, not to overwhelm it. Here and there, you shouldn't stop at one point too much. Dragging the brush like this can create an interesting broken line, which is very specific to watercolor and is more obvious on cold pressed paper, which is granulated, and when the brush is dried, so the consistency of color is consistency of melted butter. I think I'll stop here until I ruin this painting. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, don't forget to like it and to subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like other subjects to paint, please comment. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.